The question is as follows. Mr. Workington, seconded by Mr. Bertal, moves that the Speaker's ongoing and repetitive partisan conduct outside the chamber is a betrayal of the traditions and expectations of his office and a breach of trust required to discharge his duties and responsibilities, all of which this House judges to be a serious contempt and therefore declares that the office of Speaker shall be vacated effective immediately before the hour of meeting on the next Monday of the House sits, following the day that this order is adopted, and direct the election of a Speaker pursuant to Standing Order 2-2 shall be the first order of business at Monday's sitting of the House. La période de 10 minutes pour les députés.
The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person.
The motion will please rise.
Mr. Scheer.
Mr. Scheer.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Miss Lewis Holloman Norfolk.
Ms. Lewis Holloman Norfolk.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Richards.
Mr. Richards.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. Block.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Monsieur Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Morant.
Mr. Morant.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redekop.
Mr. Redekop.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Calkins.
Mr. Calkins.
Miss Rude.
Ms. Rude.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mrs. Falk Battlefords Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk Battlefords Lloydminster.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Vidal.
Mr. Vidal.
Madame Gill.
Madame Gill.
Madame Chabot.
Madame Chabot.
Monsieur Trudel.
Monsieur Trudel.
All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
Miss Sachs.
Miss Sachs.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Madame Bibot.
Madame Bibot.
Madame Martinez Farada.
Madame Martinez Farada.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Baptiste.
Mr. Baptiste.
Mr. Kuzmarchuk.
Mr. Kuzmarchuk.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Sousa.
Mr. Sousa.
Mr. Duguid.
Mr. Duguid.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Housefather.
It's coming up, Andy.
Miss Hefner.
Ms. Hepner.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Sabera.
Mr. Sabera.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Madame Diab.
Madame Tiab.
Mr. Meow.
Mr. Meow.
Mr. Carr.
Mr. Carr.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Miss McPherson.
Ms. McPherson.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Miss Barron.
Ms. Barron.
Mr. Backrack.
Mr. Backrack.
The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings. Wish to inform the House the electronic voting period has ended. If members were unable to vote due to technical difficulties and use the raise hand function, the chair will recognize them. No problems online. Nobody came running in. The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 142, 142. Nays contre 168, 168.
I declare the motion defeated.